Hey, TV historians, you are in for a treat today because we aren't going to talk necessarily about total real life adult TV, like prime time, like the stuff that makes you think. Let's talk a little bit more about the stuff that makes you smile and what makes you feel like a kid again and takes you back to just a simpler time in your viewing experience. Today's guest is Nina Bargiel, who is a funny person, a writer, and a very creative thinker. And she's middle-aged. I'm just going to say it, right? Right, Nina? There's laughter from LA coming all the way to Chicago right now.
I mean, technically, I don't lie about my age. I am 47 years old. That always seems really shocking to people. Listen, it seems shocking to people. It's not shocking to anyone as much as it is shocking to me, simply because I never thought I'd live this long.
You know, we are only as young as we feel. That's kind of what I'm thinking right now. And by virtue of technology and the creativity and the opportunities that exist everywhere, your young self is having a tremendous impact on lots of people of all ages. So I am here to welcome you to Advanced TV Herstory and let you tell your story a little bit and talk about some of the great work you've done many years ago in your younger days, as well as what's on your desk and on your desktop right now. You probably don't even have a desktop. You probably do it all from your laptop.
I do everything on my laptop. I don't even own a desk. I truly don't. I'm sitting in my guest room, right? I do write kids TV, but the joke is I do my best work from bed because pretty much everything that I write while sitting in bed. Why don't I give you a little bit, your listeners, a little bit of my background.
Bring it.
I am not a classically trained writer. I grew up right outside of Chicago in a town called Glen Ellyn, Illinois, that has about 25,000 people in it. I grew up telling stories and sort of knowing the importance of stories. My mom was born in a refugee camp in 1946. And so we didn't really have anything. I don't really have, pictures or, able to trace, my lineage back and things like that. The one thing that we had were stories. So we would sort of, like grandparents who did not speak English, would pass down stories to my mother, who speaks English, but it's her second language, who would then pass stories down to me. So I understood that was kind of when you don't have anything, that's all you have. But I never considered being able to necessarily make a living at it. It just sort of seemed kind of out there. And then when I went to college, I actually started off at Northwestern, but it was too close to home, and then finished up at BU at Boston University. At Northwestern and BU, I was a film student, and I thought I wanted to be a director, and I really wanted to be David Lynch. Like, to me, that was going to be like the pinnacle of my careers. I was going to be the female David Lynch, and I now write children's television. So my joke is always, I'm the love child of David Lynch and Barbie. So I moved out to Los Angeles, and it still did not occur to me to be a writer. I thought, well, I need to get a job that pays money, like a weekly paycheck. And I ended up actually working at an agency for an agent, and that was a nightmare. And I actually got that job. This is sort of a very strange story. I was living in Santa Barbara. It was as close to LA as I could get without paying rent. I was living with my aunt and uncle. I found a dog, and I took the dog to the animal shelter. And I was very upset because I thought I was dooming this dog to death. And the woman who headed the volunteer program at the animal shelter saw me and was like, "Oh, you're a sucker." She's like, "This dog is going to be fine. You should come volunteer here. What's your deal?" And I was like, well, I just, I moved out to LA moved out to Santa Barbara, and I'm trying to get a job in LA, and I want to work in entertainment, and I don't know anybody. And she was like, "Okay, my daughter's a TV writer. Come volunteer here." So I was like, okay. So I would volunteer at the animal shelter. I got to know this woman pretty well. After a couple of weeks, my aunt and uncle basically said, "Get a job at the Gap or we invite you to leave." I went to the shelter that day, and the woman was like, what do they know? She's like, "Come live with me." I was like, I mean, I've known her for 2 weeks, but I'm like, I can't that sort of like Midwest thing where I'm like, I can't just stay, like, what? But I did because I had nowhere to go. And, but her daughter was a TV writer. She basically like put me in contact with a whole bunch of people. That's how I got my job as an agent's assistant. Flash forward, I decided that sucked. She was like, why don't you try being a TV writer? My older brother was working in finance in New York. He hated it. So it was very much like a chocolate and the peanut butter situation. We were like, we'll be TV writers together. And then the daughter of the woman who I lived with in Santa Barbara is the woman who ran Lizzie McGuire. I was her assistant for a couple of years before she ran Lizzie on other shows. And then eventually Lizzie came up and I got my first writing job, all because I found a dog and I took it to the shelter. So don't let those strays get away.
There's lesson number 1 from Nina.
Yes. Yeah. So kind of an odd circuitous route, but it turns out I'm actually really good at it. So here I am.
Well, that's a fascinating story. And I've known you off and on for 5 years. And I don't believe I had ever heard that all of those Santa Barbara details. So
yes.
Congratulations though, as a parent of 2 now pretty functioning adults. It is a bit about the connections, and these connections are a little harder to create right now because people aren't going to be able to be face to face, and they aren't going to be able to understand what kind of work ethic you have and, what kind of table manners you have if somebody takes you out for lunch because they're kind of scoping out, what kind of a worker you think you'd be or how you might contribute to a team. So good for you that at that tender age, you were identified by people who were very much in the system as somebody who they felt confident to bring on board. That's an important lesson, I think, for anybody at any age.
Oh, absolutely. The internet is a trash fire, but it does this one thing that sometimes can be a nightmare and sometimes can be amazing, depending. And that is, it gives you access to people that you would not normally have access to. And so the ways that you would sort of show somebody that you are valuable and personable and all of those things, you just need to find a way to do that on the internet. There's a difference, sometimes when I have writers, and we'll get to this later, who approach me on Twitter, and, some people have questions and some people show up in my DMs with like, here are my 6 scripts. It's like, okay, you wouldn't just walk into my office and drop 6 scripts in my desk. Like that well, first of all, I don't have an office or a desk. So if you're showing up at my house.
And don't drop them on my bed.
Yes, you're not being allowed in my house. So there are definitely ways to do it. It's just slightly different now. There are sort of more ways in, but there are also, it still feels like sometimes fewer jobs to have.
And what I thought you were going to say, and then we will move on to the sort of the next part of our chat here. What I thought you were going to say is that the internet has become a bit, well, I guess you sort of said it. I remember you saying to me at one point, it has become a democratizer of, there's less of a pecking order. There's less of an elite.
Yeah. Like if they're on Twitter, you can at them right away. Mm-hmm. And, I apply kind of the rules of social interaction that are offline to online. Like there's still like I need to have sort of a rapport or friendship with someone before I would ask them something. Now, of course, I don't make friends based on asks or what they can do for me. Maybe if I did, I don't know, have more Emmys or something. But I think that sometimes there is this thought that writers don't need to have social skills or have kind of managerial skills. And the reality is not only do you need those as you sort of rise up the ranks, you're going to really need those. And in writing, your choice is kind of to rise up the ranks or to kind of fall off the mountain. There's always someone younger, newer, shinier coming up the ladder.
So when you do have conversations about writing for young people, and maybe you're schooling them as to what your philosophy is about writing for youth audiences, whether that's a preteen audience or what are the subsets?
So there are basically different categories of kids TV, the sort of programming ages. And I don't know them all off the top of my head, but kind of the basics are preschool. I don't write preschool. I'm not anti-writing preschool. It's just something that I haven't really done. We have kind of sort of our straightforward kids into bridge. And I believe kids is anywhere from like 5 to 9, but that's a pretty long age range. So then you start getting into bridge. We're just sort of like 9 to 11-ish. So it's sort of the end of kids, the beginning of tween. And then tween is like 10 to 13. And then you get into teen. Now, the realities are that there's lots of what's called aspirational viewing. You think about aspirational when you're actually writing too, but those categories aren't sort of set in stone. Generally, preschool stays preschool, but as kids get to like 5, 6, 7, like they may sort of watch in any of those ranges. And then you've also got sort of, teenagers who might watch younger, just sort of comfort, nostalgia, things like simplicity. I mostly work in the kids in tween space. I have worked in sort of more teen and sort of younger, but that's kind of my sweet spot.
So speaking then a little bit about, your adult head and the capacity that you have to type out scripts that are intended for young audiences. Mm-hmm. How do you, like if you were watching an episode of Grace and Frankie or Sex and the City or something, how do you think that there's a different way that you approach a script and a storytelling to a younger audience, or is storytelling kind of universal?
Here's what I think. This is my philosophy. It is not, a story is a story is a story. Now, everybody has a story about being left out. Everyone has a story of feeling like they don't measure up. Everyone has a story of being in a fight with someone they love. In Sex and the City, it might be Samantha and Carrie and like something there like that. Like it's in a more adult version, but it's still the same story. It's not, when you get to like teen, obviously, yes, you have those stories. And then when you get to kids, yes, you have those stories. It's just sort of how you choose to dramatize them, how you choose to sort of make them complex or not complex. I think like for kids, sometimes you take a little bit of the complexity out, but not really. I don't ever think I'm writing for kids. All of my writing, and I've been doing mostly animation for the last 10 years, but I still do live action. But all of my writing is based and grounded in reality. I do character-driven comedy. Character-driven comedy is simply comedy that comes from who the characters are versus the situations they are in. So the comedy comes from, like, oh, this character gets really frustrated when things aren't perfect, so I'm going to put her in a world where nothing is perfect. And she's got to sort of, deal with that as opposed to like, oh, somebody sits on a whoopee cushion. If you look at kind of the Nickelodeon classic live action, it's sort of the Dan Schneider world. He did Sam Cat, he did Victorious, he did like all of those live action. That's where sort of the screaming kind of kids acting school, that's basically Dan Schneider. And to me, listen, is that fun to watch? Sure, but it's like junk food. You consume it, it's gone. That's it. Where I am more interested in like, okay, like I want to write a story about two best friends who are in a fight. And so it like starts where it's like they're in the fight. Well, now we've got to avoid each other all day. Oh my gosh, like, they each have their own perspective. And at the end, let's get them in the hamster wheel. Well, it's like, okay, well now we're stuck together and we've got to work together to get out. Now we have a character reason to be in there versus wouldn't it be wacky? I mean, that's where sort of, all the Lizzie came from. That sort of stuff resonates. It's funny because you said at the beginning, you talked about how it like shows that make you think, where kid shows make you smile. And for me, I have to say that the reason I'm really good at writing like kids and tween and teen is that my inner life as a kid was a nightmare. It was horrible. I was a kid who was super smart, who was like, why is no one treating me like an adult? This is ridiculous. It was sort of the nightmare of like, I'm a kid and I can't do anything. And people look at me and they're like, aren't you adorable? I'm like, no, take me seriously. And so all of these things were out of my control. I think about that. Like being a writer is essentially making control of things on the page. Because when you're a kid, you can't see years into the future.
It feels as though you are writing, knowing that that audience it repopulates every year.
Right. I call it, this is not an official, I call it reverse narcissism, where it's like everyone's looking at me, but like not in a great way.
Mm-hmm.
And in sort of tapping into that space, there is this, so sort of leaning into it and sometimes making it ridiculous. I'm story editor on this show called Mao Mao, Heroes of Pure Heart, which is a kid's show. But Mao Mao himself is really a tragic figure. And like, he's got a lot of emotional baggage. And what we found is that sort of the more we lean into that, like sort of like emotional baggage, I had, the funnier I got. And so we just had this like big, like, in, because he, seems like he's like, I'm a hero, I can do all of these things. But then it's like, mommy, it's like, make it sad. And sort of the sadder we made it, the funnier it was. It was pathetic, but it was also relatable. And not like in a cringe way, but in a like, oh, I get that way. And it works in that context because I feel like animation, especially when they're not like people, they're like animals, like there's a little bit of space that might not work for like Lizzie McGuire because, Hilary is an actual person. And so you need to have that sort of a little more kind of grounded in reality.
The name's Mao Mao, and on my journey into legend, I've encountered many great foes. Yeah! One step closer to legend, baby! Unfortunately, a series of accidents has led me, an outsider, to become the sheriff protector of Pure Heart Valley.
Hiya!
Ah!
Can I hug you?
No, just...
Let's be friends!
You're supposed to be fighting me! Now the adventure really begins.
And you teach me to be a hero!
Oh, that's my deputy doorman.
Taste the pain!
Get them! What? That's Badger Clubs, my best friend / machinist / other deputy.
My man's got this.
You got this, right? Oh, Badger Clubs.
I write kids TV because I want them to feel like, hey, you know what? Like, you're not alone. We're all awkward weirdos and it sucks. But
you'll get through it.
Right. And
Yeah.
Again, all we have are stories.
So it sounds like you have your philosophy of storytelling and how you craft the story and the purpose, and even a bit of a purpose or a series of moments that you want to make sure that a young viewer, whatever that age is, can perhaps see him or herself or have it resonate in some way. You've got a long string of work that you've done, both animated and live action, the DC Superhero Girls, the Grim Adventures of Billy and Mandy, the House of, how do you pronounce that?
House of Anubis.
House of Anubis. Is a trait of all of these series and Lizzie McGuire that there is a central female character?
Not really. It's interesting. I'm like, they're all just things I got hired on. It used to be sort of like, they're all kids. But again, Billy and Mandy was sort of different. There weren't really character stories in there. It was sort of a different time at Cartoon Network. I also did not run that show. Delightful. Billy and Mandy really, for me, I got to sort of express my outer goth kid. So I started out from Lizzie. I wrote 17 episodes. It was very grounded in reality.
Mm-hmm.
Billy and Mandy, I had just sort of started doing animation. I actually just sort of started working on that show because he needed an outline. I'm like, I can write you an outline. And it just sort of happened that way. And then, because that was actually initially a board-driven show that turned into a script-driven show. And so then I wrote a bunch of scripts. DC Superhero Girls happened because I was working at Mattel. I had done Monster High, I had done Barbie. I worked on the shorts there. I did not work on the subsequent longer things. Basically, Shay Fontana had been working on kind of the larger project, but it was a lot of material and she just needed someone to come in. And for me, one of the things that I am very good at is that I'm a good hired gun in the sense that it's like, oh my gosh, we just need someone to come in here and write these character voices and write them quickly. And I can do that.
Do you have a favorite of all of that work over the years?
Here's the thing is they're all my favorite. I mean, Lizzie, I don't know if anything will ever top Lizzie in the sense that it was my first job. It was a great job. The people were lovely. I got to do things that I wouldn't get to do other places. I wrote 17 episodes. I should say, I was writing with my older brother at the time. We no longer write together. He still is my older brother. 17 out of 65 episodes. First of all, as a staff writer, you're lucky to get 2 episodes. It was just a very small writing staff. The other thing we were allowed to do is generally once your script is handed over to the director, you kind of stay away. I mean, you're available, but you don't get involved. And all of our directors really encouraged us to be down on set, really encouraged our input, encouraged us to sit in editing, do all of that stuff, watch your dailies. And so it was a good kind of primer on sort of how to be a showrunner. And even though, again, in film school, I'd seen all of these things and I'd done them when I was directing and writing my own stuff,
Sure.
to sort of do it in a professional capacity and be empowered to do it is kind of amazing.
That feels very, very analogous to the way that April Smith has described her first writing job, walking into Lou Grant as a staff writer and being shown the ropes by Gene Reynolds and encouraged to be part of this process and another process and understand the flow and the back end and the decisions. Whether it's the work that you are the most proud of, certainly as a highlight of a career and a grounding within the business, it was an invaluable experience.
Oh, absolutely. And that sort of, gets back to that really kind of being able to manage people and make decisions and be involved. Because the other thing is that, and this happens in animation in a different way, but in live action, there's a gazillion people on set. Having respect for what people do down there, not coming in, they talk about above the line and below the line and sort of crapping on people or getting in the way of a shot, really having respect for what people do, getting to know who everyone there is without interfering with their job. And what happens is again, it's once people know that you have respect for them, they have respect for you, and it becomes very collaborative. And one of the things that I always think, I'm actually working on an animated project right now with an amazing animation company. And there are times in my script, so I'm and you guys will figure this out. And I'm because they're better at it. Mm-hmm. And I'm why would I write, I'll write an action scene and I'll make sure that I'm okay, at this point, something here has to happen. And I'll write it out if I've got it in my brain. But if I don't, I shorthand it because this is what they do. I'm this is your time to sing. And why do I care? First of all, my name's on it. Second of all, why would I not want them to be empowered to do the thing that they are the best at? The way that they include you is that you include them. Mm-hmm. And so for me, that's important.
So if I can just ask a question, since I've never really understood how animation is developed, and it feels as though just by virtue of it not requiring a set and sound stage and props and key grips and everything, how then do you end up becoming sort of a collaborative team if it's a little bit more virtual? How is it that you're able to, in a sense, hand off the germination of a really great something, and you're handing it off to somebody else then who is well positioned and versed in taking it to that next step?
There are basically, when you're talking about kids animation, mm-hmm. there is board-driven animation and script-driven animation. Mao Mao here is a Pure Heart is an example of board-driven animation. So I am story editor on that show. Story editor in animation is head writer. It's weird because in live action, story editor is one of the lowest titles you can have, but in animation, it's one of the highest titles that you can have. So it gets confusing on one's resume. So I'm story editor on Mao Mao here of Pure Heart. So my job is to supervise my writers, basically produce outlines, which are then given to a board artist. There are a bunch of board artists on the show, and they are empowered. They not only board it, but they write all of the dialogue. So all of that, and there might be I might include a joke or, include little bits of dialogue at, key parts and things like that in the outline, but it is then mostly handed over to them. Once they're done with their board, usually it's 2 people on one episode. So, one might board act 1 and act 3, and one might board act 2 because it's usually longer. And then they basically do what's called a board pitch in front of the entire crew, and everybody gives notes. And I generally, sometimes I'll give like a joke note or whatever, but I generally give like the story notes. Script driven, it's different. Usually in script driven, you are very separate from that. You have a writer's room, you write the script, it's handed off, and then the board artists kind of do exactly what the script says. It's less of a kind of creative stretch for the board artist, but the writers sort of have more control. The show that I am working on now is called Novelmore. It is a Playmobil show, and that's all I can say about it. So we are in production. We actually never went down in production. So Will Film is our animation company there in Copenhagen. And so the directors are all over there. And we basically have like a script read through where I read all of the characters of my first draft. And if you want to learn humility, reading your first draft to a group of executives and directors at 7:00 in the morning, because of course the time issue.
Sure.
That's pretty much it.
Ooh,
so
there's a bucket of cold water.
Yeah. Sometimes I'll be reading and I'm like, yeah, it's not good. We'll change that. And so I'll read a scene, then they give me notes, and they read a scene, they give me notes. So, but that's essentially how it goes. Like the director of the episode is on the call, execs are on the call. Sometimes the director will be like, oh, I had an idea for, how to stage this, or, oh, we have this background we haven't used, or, oh, we have this location, or, oh, you don't know this, but there's some visual development we're doing. Or this is something that I see with writers, not just writers of animation, but just writers in general, is that sometimes in scripted animation, a writer thinks, well, I can do whatever I want because it's animated. But the reality is someone still has to draw that, or someone still has to, compute that. That has to be designed somewhere. And all of that takes time. And so for me, I'm always like, listen, there are some things that are very important to the story. Having a crowd scene with 1 million people is rarely important to my story. So I'm always very clear of like, how can I make your job easier? And then also like, this is a thing that I want to do. Can we do it? Can we sit down together? Can we figure out how it can be done? And sometimes I'll pull back and they're like, no, we can do more. Having that kind of back and forth and being aware of it is kind of great. Again, it gives everybody their chance to feel like, oh, this is my part of it. So, I write an outline, I get notes. I write a first draft, we do a read through, I get notes. I write a second draft, I get notes. I write a final. The final is then put into animatic. I watch the animatic, I give notes. We do what's called previs animation, pre-visual effects. I give notes. I think that's what previs. And so there are just like multiple steps then from there.
So it feels as though in this collaborative process, the real end of it, which maybe is even different from live action, is you're the one who is at least saying, for the first time to Advanced TV Herstory listeners, that the writing process is one that requires not so much a thick skin, but just a sense of collegiality, of professional respect, that everyone's working toward the best possible end product. And everyone will get there as long as everybody realizes what it is you're trying to achieve. And as a business matter or as a workplace environment, sometimes it's there and sometimes it's not. And sometimes people who are overly dramatic or take things personally end up, unfortunately, really damaging the environment and damaging the productivity. Have you ever had those experiences?
Oh, absolutely. Here's the thing. But when I talk about success, I talk about like having a decent work environment and having kind of a non-nightmare job. Is you need a leader, you need a showrunner with a vision, and a showrunner who can then communicate that vision. So I'm story editor on Mao Mao, Heroes of Pure Heart. The creator of that show is a gentleman named Parker Simmons. He was hiring and he was like, bring me more women, like stop bringing me dudes. And so, someone reached out, they were like, oh, do you know Nina? No. I was like, oh yeah, Mao Mao, it's Batman in the Land of Care Bears. And he was like, well, yeah. But when I started working with him, I'm like, oh, he knows exactly what he wants. there are times sort of like as story editor on a show, I might push more, but I'm like, oh, I'm going to listen. And I'm like, he's giving me all the information I need to do my job. And that is delightful.
Quick survey. What do we think of this indolent throw-rod?
Hey, everybody!
Total chiller!
And what about this charming blue thing?
She's so brave!
I wish it was you!
Now let's hear it for our daring sheriff!
Bring back the blue one!
He's so abrasive!
He's like a real wet blanket, am I right? He's like a total walnut!
All right, I get it! Get it!
Jeez! No need to yell.
Just talk a little bit, just briefly, about what are some of the emerging distribution channels?
Cartoon Network, Nickelodeon, Disney Channel, HBO Max, Peacock, which is one of the new channels.
That's just a NBC collect-all, isn't it?
Yeah, I'm sure that they're doing streaming. Disney Plus, it's sort of separate from Disney Channel. Oh, Apple is starting to do some. I met on some things and pitched them some things. So those are all avenues that exist. When you're working in animation, there's also international. So like Cartoon Network here, there's also like Cartoon Network Germany, England, all of that stuff over there. And when you look at an international market, it gets even bigger. So I actually end up working a lot internationally as well. So it's just kind of all over the place.
Cool. Definitely an area of TV that we here on the podcast haven't really talked much about or learned about. We certainly have come to understand how the whole spectrum of availability and access has changed by virtue of streaming, and also as media entities have become more conglomeratized. Just made up that word. Yeah. The access to some of the vintage shows and the good shows, and how it's always going to be controlled unless you happen to have it on DVD in your personal collection or go out and buy it now. All right. Speaking of DVDs in the personal collection, we would be remiss if we didn't dig a little deeper into Lizzie McGuire and some of those 17 episodes. And, the reason that it even made sense for us to have this conversation now is, first of all, you've just got so many interesting irons in the fire, but also had just appeared on a Zoom cast, I guess, that's now on Hilary Duff's YouTube channel, which was a table read of your episode by the Lizzie McGuire cast. So for those listeners who are either too old or too young to be spot on with their Lizzie McGuire deep dive, tell us a little bit about the years that Lizzie was on, and just the novelty. To me, the novelty, it's almost a throwback to the Patty Duke show. There have not been that many series on where the title character was a girl. And in Patty Duke's case, she was the first to actually have the show named after herself. If it had been the Hilary Duff show, then of course that would have been different. It would have fallen in those footsteps. But there aren't too many series out there. But at that time, my gosh, it was Lizzie McGuire and it was Raven, or That's So Raven, and some others. So, refresh us. What was it like, and what were those years?
So we're looking at 2000. So I worked on Lizzie from 2000 to 2002. We did 65 episodes in those 2 years. They held back. They actually did 3 seasons. Lizzie was really aimed at kind of that, again, like I didn't even know, like, did Tween exist before Lizzie? It must have, but really kind of that like 9 to 13-year-old audience. But here was the secret, is that Lizzie's highest rated, the highest numbers that we got were Friday nights at like 10:30. And what they realized were college students were watching Lizzie before they were going out for the evening. Like our audience was like 6 to 36. Like it was bananas. And when we started, we didn't know this. We literally were just writing kind of average is the wrong word to use, but like we wanted her to be a normal girl. Mm-hmm. We wanted her, she didn't have superpowers. She didn't have famous parents. She just was kind of an every girl. And
middle America. Yeah. Every girl. Mm-hmm.
It was sort of a thing where she wasn't aspirational. It wasn't one day I can be Lizzie. It's I am Lizzie. And that I think was the difference. First of all, Hilary Duff is gorgeous. She did not have an awkward, period in her adolescence like the rest of us. She is very relatable. She's a lovely human being. She was a lovely kid. But the thing is, she did kind of the I love Lucy, the sort of klutzy thing really well. Mm-hmm. And so that was sort of the thing that took her down a peg. Basically, I just sort of took kind of every terrible moment and tried to find a way to dramatize, to put it on screen. It happened to our main character over and over and over again. Now, there are some stories I love to tell. Like, I love when an enemy and, a friend have to work together. Mm-hmm. And so it's like, where can I put, Kate and Lizzie together? I'll do that all day because I just love that stuff. Also, I love writing a villain. It's one of my favorite things to do.
And so within the 40 or 40 plus episodes that you and your brother didn't write, how did all of these sort of flow? Did there need to be a certain amount of continuity about something that happened with the Mean Girls?
There was no continuity. There were, okay, so here's what happened. So my brother and I are writing team, Tim Mayle and Doug Tuber are writing team, and a woman named Melissa Gould. So 3 essentially writers, 2 entities, writing teams, and another writer. Because we were so busy, we did not really have a writer's room. I think at the very beginning, this first week or 2, we all sat down together and talked about stuff, but then we all went to our corners and wrote. And we would come up with premises and hand them in. And sometimes because our offices were near each other, we'd be like, hey, are you doing a dance episode? They're like, yeah, I'm doing a dance episode. Okay, I'm going to do spring fling. Okay, I'm going to do fall formal. And that was it. And that's why people are like, why are there so many dances on Lizzie McGuire? It's like, because we didn't have time to talk to each other. And so there was no continuity. If there is continuity, it is by mistake. Thing is, for a show like that, like a traditional sitcom, it's very episodic. The Aaron Carter episode ended up being a holiday episode because of me. My brother and I went to Aaron Carter's 13th birthday party, and which we were asked to do. And I really do recall it being sponsored by Absolute Vodka. They had banners there. That's all I'm saying. So essentially, we were supposed to talk to him about being on the show, but somebody else had done that. Because I'm like, why do I have to? I'm a staff writer. But Hilary was there, Lelaine was there, all of our kids were there. It was lovely. They had super fun. Hilary, really, she had a crush on him. And he did not know that she existed. And so, because the show had not come out yet.
Oh, wow.
So I could have the date wrong, but he did not know who she was. We were asked, what's the Aaron Carter episode? And so I was thinking, and this is I'd say the only time that I worked backwards. And if you look at the Aaron Carter episode, there isn't really a big character story. I might have tried to, put one in there, but it's a romp. It's a farce. And I was like, she really likes him. How can I get them to kiss? And I was like, mistletoe. And so I was like, it's a Christmas episode.
Oh, yeah.
What if they're shooting a Christmas video, because you can shoot those anytime. And they were like, oh. So I think at the very beginning, it's like, but it's not Christmas. It's like, they shoot those in June. There's some sort of very clunky, but yeah, no continuity. So,
well, in the end, when you're dealing with sort of family style shows, do you think back to, did the Brady Bunch have much continuity? No, it's a sitcom and it's supposed to make people feel good and a little insight into somebody else's family. So I don't think the world is worse for your continuity lapses. Friends who are friends one week are mortal enemies the next, and back to being friends the next month. So
exactly.
I think there's some reality there. Let's talk a little bit about that Zoom gathering and how it came together.
Jake Thomas, actually, who played Matt, had the idea and reached out to Hilary and basically asked her, what episode do you want to do? And she chose the bra episode. Jake and I, we follow each other on Instagram and, on the socials. We've been chatty for years. He is so delightful. Jake and Lelaine, I'm chatty with.
And the script, where are scripts of actual series kept now, given the fact that When it aired, well, yeah, there was the internet, but it was followed by your dial-up wah, wah, wah.
Jake, I have actually my floppy disks from that time. I did have a hard copy, but Jake still had a hard copy, and his dad scanned it, the script, and sent it to everybody.
Aw.
Yeah. So like 33 pages or something like that. So hats off to Bob Thomas.
And Hilary, I watched it. I would encourage listeners to watch the table read, because you do get it's a little bit like a director's cut when you get a special edition of a DVD or something. Some interesting voiceover and reflection.
We hear platform flip-flops approaching.
Yeah, I'd like to see a lawyer.
Hilary Duff and the cast of Lizzie McGuire took to Instagram for a virtual reunion.
We haven't all been together in a very long time.
And they're raising money for organizations supporting those affected by the coronavirus pandemic.
We also wanted to ask, if you're in the position to be able to donate any money, then we have provided a few links below to some of our favorite charities. And if not, no problem. Thanks for being here. And hopefully you could just help spread the word.
And yes, the cast can still sing the show's theme song. Well, kind of. Pull off a very entertaining script reading of a classic Lizzie McGuire episode.
I want a bra!
A bra! Okay, I want a bra!
Ew! That's disgusting!
Mrs. McGuire, suddenly I don't want to go to the mall with you guys.
We're supposed to be adults.
So
tell her we want to shop alone.
if you're so adult, then you tell her.
Are you insane? You tell her.
This reunion is kind of bittersweet considering it's the closest we'll see Lizzie McGuire again anytime soon.
It's so funny, like rewatching it, because I'm like, it's so ridiculous, but it's also so real. And I think that just sort of her capturing kind of that mortification on that level. And I think that's also really why the episode works.
Well, yes, it's a rite of passage, and there are women's rites of passage and there are male rites of passage. And as you might expect, given the predominance in media of all sorts, we focus on the male ones. And in some cases, we aren't even allowed to focus on some of the female ones because we end up using words or it depicts body functions that men don't know how to handle. And that's really unfair for so many different reasons, not the least of which is being able to tell stories and educate.
It's hard for me sometimes to always find the comedy. I'm like, where's the comedy here? Like, where can I push it? Like, where are those moments where I can really dig in? And in animation, it's always like, where can I find like the really like ridiculous stuff? But like finding kind of the heart of it all, that's always easy for me. Constantly fascinated by human behavior. And there are times where like, I'll be watching TV and be like, oh, this is what happens. And people are like, how do you know that? I'm like, well, because that's, so when I'm surprised by something, I'm always like, oh my God, like I love it. People's behavior generally makes sense. I mean, we can generally figure out like, oh, this seems like I don't understand this. Then you're like, oh, I understand this because of X, Y, and Z. Like it's that sort of idea of like people don't change. If your characters are behaving in a certain way, when you put them in stress, like you know how they're going to behave. And if they behave the opposite, then you need to explain why. That's essentially kind of where those stories come from. I think about kids stuff as a feeling. I think about this. Sometimes people are like, oh, you know, you wrote for Mattel and that's just toys. And I'm like, right, but how did your toys make you feel? How did you feel when you like played with Barbie? Was it about like, oh yeah, I wanted the car and I wanted the dream house, whatever, but it was about the stories I made up for Barbie. It was about like the connection to the toy is about a relationship. It's about a story. Am I evoking a feeling, whether it's, you know, it can be laughter and joy, but like, does it come from a real place?
Sure. Well, it feels as though, you know, I included listeners in the outline that I sent to Nina. I said, okay, so advice for writers. I would say, I hope you've been paying attention to this entire interview because there are probably at least 10 critical points regarding storytelling, entering the entertainment field, finding voice, finding authenticity in what it is that you're proposing your characters do and why they would be doing it. And you don't get that often from TV writers just because they don't slow down and they don't have somebody asking them questions. So Nina, I'm super grateful that you took some time out of all of your projects to bring this masterclass to our listeners.
You are so welcome. And
I will ask this last question that I often ask people. You seem to enjoy your TV, and you also seem to remember an awful lot about the influences of your childhood, both the TV ones as well as the storytelling. Name 3 series from your youth or even from your young adulthood that you felt really made a difference, helped you with representation and seeing yourself.
Square Pegs.
Oh my gosh. Well,
Square Pegs is built, first of all, you've got early Sarah Jessica Parker, you've got Jamie Gertz, you've got
Ann Bates.
You've got the waitresses, the soundtrack is amazing. And it only went 1 seain.
It was kind of a disaster on the back end.
Yeah, it was, but super delightful. Like that's one where I'm like, oh, that just, wow. Like I wish we could have had more of that, but that was the only time where I felt like, oh, this feels like me.
Okay. So Square Pegs.
The Muppet Show. I've always loved the Muppet Show. I love the Muppets. And the thing that I realized about the Muppet Show is the Muppet Show was funny. The Muppet Show was not funny for kids. The Muppet Show was funny. Did not talk down. Had jokes for everybody.
It was clever.
Yes. And like the Muppet Show, got the Muppet Show on DVD. And because I'm like, I'm going to rewatch this. And I'm like, oh, this holds up. Like it's ridiculous, but like this holds up. Like they get it. And
the guests, some of the guest stars were just treasures.
But you don't talk about they're sketches, but it's a character-based comedy. You know who Miss Piggy is. You know who Kermit is. You know who Fozzie is. You know every sort of character.
Those archetype. 2 old men.
Yeah. Like Statler and Wardolph. Like you know what they look like, but you know how they're going to react. Yes. Like if Statler and Waldorf are like, that was great, I love it. You're like, no, something's wrong. Are we switch personalities day? Like you know it right away. Like Muppet Show characters.
Okay, so there's 2.
The other 2 are sort of a tie. One is the Addams Family, which I used to basically obviously watch in reruns. You know, like some people are Munsters people, but like I've been Morticia Addams till I die. Even though as a kid, I liked Morticia more than I liked Wednesday. I think because Wednesday sort of had a coolness that I did not have as a kid. I was just quiet and then weird.
Morticia was like Esmeralda. I mean, she was Agnes Moorehead from Bewitched all over again. She had style.
And that was probably aspirational, where it's like one day I can have that and like I can find my Gomez. Like so I was like, oh, I just want someone to worship me. And then like wear amazing black dresses. So so Addams Family is one. The other one, I was slightly too old for it, but I was like, oh, this is great, is Gem and the Holograms. Actually went back and watched the Gem pilot. Okay, first of all, the Gem pilot opens essentially on a funeral. This is a kids animated show that opens on a funeral. I'm like, that is bold. Like I cannot believe that they got to do that.
The span of shows that you've just offered up is going to send every listener tracking for a revisit to their favorite Muppet Show episodes. Square Pegs. I mean, the demographics you've just covered are pillar to post, but there's some really good stuff out there, and not totally female centric, but clearly you saw yourself in, I mean, the Gem and the Holograms and Square Pegs and the Addams Family, there were women there for you.
I was looking for it. There just wasn't a lot. So it's like, where can I find them? And it's like, here they are.
Yes. Tell our listeners how they can track you, get a hold of you, follow you, and all of your exploits.
You can find me on the internet. I am Slack Mistress. That is Slack and Mistress together. On Twitter, Instagram, Facebook.
Nina, it has been a joy to share stories and share backgrounds with you. And in the end, Hogan's Heroes just did not cut it for every generation of American women. Some of those scripts, the scripts of the 70s and 80s really were progressive in a very fulfilling way. When we looked at them, we just thought that we'd be further ahead. 45 years later.
And that is also why I write kids TV, because someone needs to talk to all the kids.
And that's why I podcast. Isn't that the coolest way to end this episode?
Full circle.
Hey there, wasn't that a lot of fun? Oh my gosh. Again, I'd like to thank Nina Bargiel, who you will find on social media as Slack Mistress, for joining us today. If you're curious about Mao Mao, Heroes of Pure Heart, one project that Nina's working on, which, by the way, is the series you heard little bits of earlier, head over to Cartoon Network. Find the table read of Lizzie McGuire's bra episode on YouTube. That was profiled on Entertainment Tonight earlier this spring, and again, those clips appear in this episode. Many thanks to Catherine Yang for her commitment to quality sound artistry. This is why your ears are not buzzing right now. Our music is Jazzer's Take Me Higher and can be found at freemusicarchive.com. Get behind-the-microphone stories and insights from me by signing up for our newsletter. Just head over to tvherstory.com, and while you're there, stroll through our vault, and you're sure to find old episodes that scratch your itch to talk TV. Far from the poison ivy, but often in the weeds. That's why I podcast. I'm your host, Cynthia Bemis Abrams.